Good evening, everybody. A special welcome to Ellie and Jenny Abraham from Detroit for sponsoring the shir tonight. Again, I think they do hold the record for most shirim sponsored. And we have Mr. Abraham with us as well. Welcome. Topic this evening is Bar Yochai. I'd like to teach you the song in the official Sephardi accent, and we'll sing it together. Bar Yochai. Truth is, Rabbi Azarad. A quick rendition, a little something for the tzibur. Off the record. So we know there's many different ideas surrounding Lag BaOmer. The famous Gemara with Rabbi Akiva, his students who were passing away up until Lag BaOmer. And the Shulchan Aruch tells us that Lag BaOmer is a day where we don't say Tachnun. There's some level of simcha because the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. That's one idea that we've explored in previous shirim. And we also know there's much to be said regarding the connection between Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and Lag BaOmer. If you were to ask most people what is that connection, they would probably tell you Lag BaOmer is the yard site of the Rashbi. Many do suggest that's the case, but we'll see there might be more to it than that. I'd like to get involved briefly with the personality, what we know from different places throughout Shas and Chazal, of the Rashbi, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and tie it into the celebration of Lag BaOmer. Many of us are familiar with the Chazal that teaches us in the generation of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai there was never a rainbow in the sky, which testifies to his righteousness. Generally, the rainbow is a bris that HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to send the world, that although there is evil taking place, there's injustice, but I'm not going to destroy you. I'm showing the rainbow as a covenant, as a bris between myself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and humanity. However, if there's never that level of evil which would warrant HaKadosh Baruch Hu showing the symbol of a rainbow, then there's no need for a rainbow. So, generation of the Rashbi, there was never a rainbow. Once he passed away, that was the first time in many, many years that the world had a rainbow. And the Bnei Yissaschar and others, and they explain this might be the makar, this might be the source for why the Talmidim go out into the fields and play softball. Where back in the olden days, before softball, they would play with bows and arrows. Hatamhu, the reason's based on this idea, that during the lifetime of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, there was not a keshes to be found, and only once he passed away, on the day of his petira, then there had to be a rainbow in the sky, so the bow and arrow is representing the keshes. The Bnei Yissaschar goes on to say, he says, furthermore, this might explain the minhag of lighting a fire. I was in the parking lot today of Young Israel, and from a distance I saw what looked to be like a teepee. And I wasn't sure what it was. And as I got closer, I realized they're really setting up for Lag BaOmer. They're making us look bad over here. Isaac, we have to do something about this. We have the beer chametz. That's a good spot for a teepee. But where does this idea come from? So explains the Bnei Yissaschar. Shenogin laharbos ba'or b'yom hahu, yoma dehilula de Rashbi. Because it was on that day when the Rashbi left the world, he was megaler rozin b'yom hahu be'idra kedisha, in his holy circle amongst those who were learning Kabbalah from Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. He revealed deep secrets of the Kabbalah representing the Or HaTorah, the light, and that's why we have the bonfire. So we have the bow and arrow, we have the bonfire. Everything is understood now regarding Lag BaOmer. Now this Gemara of Rabbi Akiva, where it speaks about the terrible tragedy of losing his Talmidim, The Gemara's description of what the world was after his yeshiva was decimated is Hay ha'olam shamem, that the world was totally destroyed. It was desolate. Right? The Torah power that we had, the Masorah, that was really being held up by the yeshiva of Rabbi Akiva, was no longer here. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva, Eitzor Rabbeinu shebedrom. Rabbi Akiva picked himself up, he went to the south, and he taught 5 new Talmidim, Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon, and Reb Elazar ben Shemua. And Reb Shimon, we know all throughout Mishnayos, is always a reference to Reb Shimon bar Yochai. So he had 5 new Talmidim, V'heim heim hemidu Torah oso shah, and they were the ones that were able to hold up the Torah in that time period. They were able to make themselves a link in the chain. In Rav Yaakov Hillel's Sefer, Ascending Jacob's Ladder, he says most people think of Lag BaOmer, like we mentioned, as the day of Reb Shimon bar Yochai's passing. It is called the Yom Hilula, a day of rejoicing, because when a tzaddik passes on, he takes with him a lifetime of holiness and goodness. The Arizal calls Lag BaOmer Yom Simchaso, the day of his happiness, referring to the Simcha of the Rashbi. Because on this day, Reb Shimon bar Yochai was ordained, he was given smicha by Rabbi Akiva. So the Arizal doesn't say that Lag BaOmer is the yard site of the Rashbi. What he does say is that this was the day that after Rabbi Akiva left his yeshiva and he tried to cultivate 5 new Talmidim, he gave smicha to Reb Shimon bar Yochai. That was Lag BaOmer. Yaakov Hillel writes, we actually have no authoritative source going back hundreds of years that tells us that Lag BaOmer is actually the day of the Rashbi's passing. However, there is a tradition that he passed away on that very day. The Aruch HaShulchan and others bring that tradition. The Arizal does not dispute this, but he does explain that the joyous celebration is not because of the passing of the Rashbi, but rather it's because of the smicha, the ordination that was granted to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai on the 33rd day of the Omer. He says both the Chida and the Ben Ish Chai say that on Lag BaOmer was not only a special day for the Rashbi, but for the other Talmidim as well. All 5 Talmidim Rabbi Akiva, they were officially granted smicha on the 33rd day of the Omer. We see throughout Shas that Reb Shimon bar Yochai was a devoted Talmid of Rabbi Akiva. There's a story in the Gemara in Pesachim where it says Rabbi Akiva was in prison and there was a decree against him that he was not allowed to teach Torah. However, the Rashbi snuck his way into the area where Rabbi Akiva was being held, and he said, Rebbe, lamdeini Torah, please teach me Torah, tell me something, give me some wisdom. Rabbi Akiva said back, Eini melamdcha, I'm not going to teach you, I'm not allowed to, I'll be risking your life. Amalo im eina tamalamdeini ani omer leYochai Abba umosrecha lemalchus. So he said, if you don't teach me Torah, I'm going to tell my father, Yochai, and he'll give you into the authorities. Now, he was already given into the authorities, but that was his way of expressing his deep desire to learn from his great Rebbe. Parenthetically, it's interesting that he calls his father by his name. That's for a different halachic discussion. How was he able to do that? It could be because he adds the word Abba, which is a phrase of dignity or chashivas.
Interestingly, the accusation, because at the end, Moran Shabbos, that he ends up being a fugitive from the Malchus.
Okay, we're going to get there as well. So Amrlo Rabbi Akiva says back, Beni, you should know, Yosim imasha egel rotze linak, pora rotze lahonik. This is the famous line that more than the calf wants to nurse, the mother wants to give milk, the mother wants to express milk. So no matter how much you want to be learning Torah, trust me, I want to be teaching you Torah. It's more pain and anguish for me than it is for you. But this is a glimpse into the relationship between the Rashbi and Rabbi Akiva and the devotion that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai had for his great Rebbe. The Gemara in Gittin says that when Reb Shimon Bar Yochai would speak to his Talmidim, he would sometimes say, "Banai, my children, you should learn from me, because everything that I have, every aspect of Torah that I'm sharing with you, is the creme de la creme of Rabbi Akiva." Right, so the Rashbi spoke French as well, but his point was, not only have I learned everything I know from Rabbi Akiva, but I've been able to distill the chachma that I can give it over to you in a clear and concise and powerful way. Who was one of the great Talmidim of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai? So he had many, but one of the most well-known was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the actual compiler and the editor of the Mishnah. We have the Gemara in Shabbos that tells us Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi learned under Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and just now appreciating the words of the Gemara that when the yeshiva of Rabbi Akiva was decimated, ha'olam shamem, the world was totally desolate, it was destroyed, until he went down to the south. He was able to give smicha to 5 new Talmidim according to the Arizal. That smicha was given on Lag BaOmer, right? So the continuity of the Mesorah, so to speak, was staying alive on Lag BaOmer. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the 5 Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, becomes the Rebbe of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the author of the Mishnah. So not only was he a makabel of the Mesorah, but he was a nosei, and he was one of the Balei Mesorah. He was able to give on the Torah that he received from his great Rebbe. Now most people, when you think of the greatest accomplishment of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, what name comes to mind? What sefer? The Zohar. The Zohar. We're not going to get involved now with the questions of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the historical debate, but Al Pi Mesorah, the Gra, the Ramchal, the Maral, all of the Gedolei Yisrael understood that the Zohar is traced back to the teachings and the wisdom of the Rashbi. And just to get a time frame here, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was born right around the Churban Bayis Sheni, so around the year 70 CE. So the teachings that we have in the Zohar that go back to the Rashbi are about 1,800 years old, 1,900 years old. The truth is, you could argue his greatest accomplishment was not just the Zohar, that's the Torah of Nister, right, the Kabbalah, but Nigla. If you look throughout Mishnayos, how many times is Reb Shimon quoted? And again, whenever the Mishnah says, Amar Reb Shimon, it means Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So more than 300 times throughout Shas, he is the 4th most quoted name in all Mishnayos. So his greatest contribution was not only the Zohar, but every halacha, every hashkafa that we have from the Rashbi, all throughout Shas. So many of the halachos that we observe every single day, every Shabbos, are based on the opinion of Reb Shimon. And we paskin like Reb Shimon often. But obviously Zohar was a very special contribution to the world. And although all of the 5 new Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, the ones that in his own words he describes, I taught these in my old age, the Rashbi was clearly known for his expertise in the Torah's Hanister, in the world of Jewish mysticism. I'd like to take a look here together. This is from the Hagdama to the Eitz Chaim, the introduction to the Sefer Eitz Chaim that was composed by Rav Chaim Vital. And he was probably the greatest disciple of the Arizal, the only disciple that the Arizal allowed to write down his teachings. In this introduction, he speaks about the Rashbi, and he says, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael asher lo ozav chasdo v'amito. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't leave us. V'nosan lanu Torah mitis v'chay olam nata b'sochenu. He gave us the truth of Torah. He implanted the Torah within us. V'hivdi lanu me'amei rotzos. He separated us from the other nations. V'nasan lanu chukav u'mishpatav ha'yesharim. And he gave us his mitzvos that are true. It was with the Chibur Yisera, it was with the great love, the Ava, that he allowed us to know Rozeh, the secrets of the Torah. The Torah's hapanimius, the Torah of the internal world. He says, based on the depth, based on the complexity of Kabbalah, it was never allowed to be shared openly and explicitly, either in Torah Shebichsav, in the written word, or even Torah Shebal Peh, or passed along orally. However, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did make mention or create allusions within the Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh to deeper Kabbalistic ideas. The Nevi'im speak about these concepts. We have Gemaras and Agadata, but everything is shrouded in mystery on purpose. These are not for public consumption. There had to be special training. You had to be part of a special school of those who were groomed for learning the Chachmas HaNister, the wisdom of Kabbalah. It's interesting, actually, the Ramban refers to this in his introduction to his commentary on the Chumash. The Ramban had a very unique Masorah in Kabbalah himself. But writes Reb Chaim Vital, what happened throughout the generations is that this Chachma, this hidden wisdom, was weakened. And there were fewer people who were really trained, who had the expertise to understand the amkus, the beauty and the depth of this Chachma. Ad Hofiya Hashem in Hashemayim, Dover Bekadsho Bahar Homer Al Yadei, Rashbi, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, V'Chaverov. Until HaKadosh Baruch Hu orchestrated that there should be a chizik, there should be this infusion of strength to the Chachmas HaNister, to the wisdom of Kabbalah, through Reb Shimon bar Yochai and his Chevra and his Talmidim. La'akma shechinta me'afra, to pick up the divine presence from the dust and to raise up the banner of Torah in the world. And he goes on to say that the light and the splendor and the radiance that was brought back into Olam Hazeh through the Rashbi v'Chaverov, it's an Or HaKadosh, it's the holy light that was brought back into the world by the Rashbi. What was the secret to his success? What was it about Reb Shimon bar Yochai that allowed him to not just be makabel and absorb and internalize the wisdom of Torah, both nigla and nister, but what was that secret ingredient that allowed him to pass it on? And as we see, up until this point, it's a very difficult tradition to pass on authentically because you can't be explicit and you can't write things down. And the ideas must be shrouded in mystery. So what was the nakuda, what was that quality that the Rashbi had? I think the answer is actually found in the Zohar itself. Number 9, we have a quote here of the Zohar. Amar Rabbi Abba, Kol ilin chavrei, de lo rechimin ilin leilin. Whenever you have a group of lomdim, of people learning together, but there's a lack of love or respect for each other, istalku me'alma ad lo mota zamnaihu, they will be taken from the world before their time. They and their Torah will not continue. An example of that would be Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. The Gemara says, as we mentioned last week, the only reason we know why the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva were not protected against this pandemic was lo nogu kavod zelezeh. They didn't treat each other with respect. It sounds like Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, with his Talmidim, he was able to take the lesson of what happened in his Rebbe's yeshiva and work the opposite direction. Kol Chavrayu b'yoma de Rebbe Shimon. The Zohar says all of the Talmidim, under the guidance of Rebbe Shimon, Rechimu de nafshe rucha have benayhu. There was a sense of achdus, of camaraderie, of mutual respect. Ubegin kach, and because of this, bidora de Reb Shimon be'isgol hava. The Zohar here tells us explicitly the reason why Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was zocha to be the conduit of Torah's Hanister, of Kabbalah, is because of the achdus that he was able to generate amongst his students. Tahavi Omer Reb Shimon, because Reb Shimon said, Kol chavrai de lo rachim eilan al eilan. If you ever have talmidim who are not loving and caring for each other as is appropriate, garmin de lo lach be'orach meishar, v'od da'avden pegima ba. Not only will they and their Torah not last, but they're being pogame. They're defiling, they're disgracing the Torah. Because the behavior is really the exact opposite of what the Torah calls upon us to do. Because Torah is truth. Truth comes with a sense of rachmanis, of compassion and love. And if you're lacking that humanity, then you're lacking the Torah. So it seems like what the yeshiva of Rebbe Akiva was lacking, that was the success of the Rashbi. Now we know the famous story of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, where they had to hide from the Roman authority, and first they were in the Beis Medrash together, but then as the Gezerah was intensified, they realized that it was not a safe place to stay. So therefore they decided to go to a local cave. The famous Maisa of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Beno, Elazar, living in the cave together for 12 years, the Gemara says, and the whole thing was miraculous. Israchish nisa ibrlahu charuva ve'ena demaya. There was a carob tree that was growing there, and there was a spring of water. I always had the question, though, if you want to sustain the Rashbi and his son, why a carob tree, right? Make it something that actually tastes good, right? Maybe an apple tree, a mango tree. But they were living through miracles. And in order not to wear out their clothing, they would take off their clothing, they would stay all day immersed in the sand, they'd be learning Torah together at meditation, and when it was time for tefillah, then they got dressed again. After 12 years, Eliyahu Navi comes to the entrance of the cave, and he says, no longer a need to be concerned. The emperor and the Gezerah, they're gone. Okay, Baruch Hashem, they come out of the cave, and we know how the story continues. The first thing we're told is, Chazu inish de kakari vizari. They see their people working and plowing and harvesting, and they were taken aback. How in the world manichin chay olam v'oskin b'chay yisha? Don't you realize that we're here in Olam Hazeh for just a few minutes, and there's so much to accomplish in the realm of spirituality, and you're just outside working the field? What is the matter with you? Kol makom shenostin einehen miyad nisraf. And anywhere they would look immediately, it would be burnt to a crisp. They had no tolerance for any engagement in the physical world because they were kulo ruchani. They were totally spiritual beings after those 12 years in the cave. The only problem was that being a purely spiritual being in this world, not a good combination. And you're going to end up destroying people. So the Baskol comes out and says, back in your room. If you're not ready to behave, another 12 months in the cave. And that's what happened. So a year goes by. Finally, they get a chance to come out again, one more try. And they hear the Baskol, Tz'u mimarasechem, come out of your cave, and they do so. Now this time, the Gemara doesn't say that wherever they looked, or wherever they set their gaze upon, it would be nisraf, it would burn. Rather, kol heiche dehave moche Rebbe Lazar, whatever they would encounter, somehow Rebbe Lazar would strike it in some way. Have moser Rebbe Shimon, but Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, his father, would be able to heal whatever Rebbe Lazar did. So the father, right, the Rashbi, was damage control over his son as they got acclimated back into the real world, so to speak. Now, it's interesting, the end of the story, we know that the son-in-law of the Rashbi, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, he sees his father-in-law, and obviously he looks very different than he did before they had to escape. And he's giving him a massage, he's trying to treat his wounds, and he sees that his back has cracks and it's wrinkly, and there are wounds all over the place, and he starts to cry, and one of the tears drips onto the back of his father-in-law. And the Rashbi lets out a scream. It's painful. Pinchas ben Yair says, Oy li sheri'isacha bekach. Woe to me that I have to see you in this condition. You've been through so much suffering. You're worn out. You're ois mensch. You're in so much pain. The Rashbi says back, Asherecha sherisanu bekach. Right? You're fortunate to see me like this. She'il mole lo reisani bekach, because if I wasn't in this condition right now, lo matzasi bekach, you wouldn't find the level of growth and Torah and wisdom that I have within me. Which is an amazing insight that the Rashbi was telling his son-in-law, yes, I've been through really, really difficult times, and I have been suffering, and leaving the world and my family behind for 13 years is not something that I would have chosen to do if I had the option initially. However, I could also look back at my suffering, and I could say with confidence, I'm a different person because I had to go through it. Somehow the Yisurim, the Emelus, that toil and suffering, enabled me to absorb the wisdom of Torah to a degree that I would never have been zocha to otherwise. So Ashrecha, you're fortunate to see me like this. I was always wondering, based on this Gemara, when they finally get out of the cave, why was it so much easier for Reb Shimon Bar Yochai to get back into society and not strike everything that he saw? But for his son, Elazar, it was a longer transition. If anything, I would have assumed the opposite. The Rashbi was on a higher madrega than his son. He was in the Himmels. He was mamish, like the Malachim. I would have assumed it would be a lot more difficult for the Rashbi to get back down into the Olam Hazeh mentality. So I saw in Oros Hagra, this is a quote from the Vilna Gaon, where he explains the difference between Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rebbe Lazar. The Gra says, Lefish Rebbe Lazar lo haya baki adayin b'tzarchei olam. Before Elazar went into the cave, he was nichnas b'yaldusa lemara. He went in as a young boy. And he never really had interactions or engagement with the world. Ulekach b'ma'at zman nishkach mimenu darchei olam. Therefore, after a few years, the ways of the world were forgotten to Elazar. Alva Reb Shimon Bar Yochai kavar haya zokin kishen nichnas lamara, and there is some discussion chronologically at what point did the Rashbi go into the cave, and the Gra is telling us clearly it was when he was older. V'hayodei b'tzarchei olam, and he was already aware of how things worked in Olam Hazeh. V'lo nishkach mimenu tzarchei olam. He didn't forget the physicality. He was able to transcend way above and beyond it, but he still understood what Olam Hazeh was, and that's why it was an easier transition for the Rashbi than it was for his son, Elazar. That's what the Gra says. Now, it's clear throughout Shas that the Rashbi really lived on a whole different plane of hashkacha. The Gemara in Me'ilah tells us that when they were trying to figure out who to send to the Roman authorities to rip up the gezeros, the decrees against the Jews, they chose Reb Shimon Bar Yochai because shehu melumad benisim. He's experienced. He's used to living with miracles. So let's send the Rashbi, and I'm sure things will work out. So the Gemara relates that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai went along. He took somebody else with him. And as they're going to Rome, he has no plan formulated yet, but that's part of living on a miracle. Nizdamin la, he says, Yatsa de Kroso ben Tamalion. Ben Tamalion, who was actually a shade, right? It was a demon. Ben Tamalion came to greet the Rashbi and his partner as they were walking to the Roman authority. And he said politely, would you like me to come with you? I could give you a hand. What's the response of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai? Bacha Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, he started to cry. And he said, Ma shivcha shel beis Abba nizdamin la malach shlosh pamim. Avram Avinu had a shivcha, her name was Hagar. And she was zocha to have an angel appear to her 3 times. And I can't even get one angel. All I can get is a shade. Rebbeisai, after all of my years of work and bitachon, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're only giving me a shade? Nonetheless, he said, if that's all I could get for now, let's go. And they go together, and the story continues that the shade possesses the body of the daughter of the emperor. And then as soon as Shimon Bar Yochai gets there, there's a whole commotion, there's a scene, there's a crisis. And they turn to the rabbi who seems holy and wise. Can you do something? My daughter has been taken advantage of by some spiritual force. And the Rashbi says, no problem. He says, Ben Talmon say, leave Ben Talmon, go out of the girl. And that's what happens. And Baruch Hashem, through this, they were able to destroy the decrees against the Jews. But we're talking about a human being where when he came home and his wife said, so how was the trip to Rome? It was okay. Were you successful? Yeah. Were you able to get rid of all those bad decrees? Yeah, we found it, we ripped it up. So what's the matter, honey? You did such a wonderful job. And he starts to cry. He said, you don't understand, right? Ben Talmon had to come and help us? A demon? We couldn't even get one malach. That was the madreg of the Rashbi. Now, although he was living with miracles, his Rebbe Akiva, gave the clear advice, and it's a halacha we find in Shulchan Aruch as well, it's quoted, Asay Shabbat chachol v'al titztarich lebrios. Better to make your Shabbos mundane and not to have fancy food than to need to ask other people for money. So you could have a lot of bitachon, you could be living with the clarity of Einon Milvado, but at the same time, be smart, be responsible. Don't just throw away money, you have to make sure you're keeping a budget, you're keeping a cheshbon. But when it came to the discussion of how many hours a day should I be learning versus working, so we know that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was the bar plugta, he argued with Rabbi Yishmael, and he was of the opinion, have to learn every second of the day. None of this narishkeit that I have to make a parnasa, and I have to bring home money for the family, and health insurance, and car insurance, and electricity. Just learn, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take care of you. The expression of the Rashbi was, Efsher Adam Chorish b'shas Charisha, Zarei b'shas Zariya, V'kotze b'shas Katzira, V'dosh b'shas Disha. You're going to do all these things, the harvesting and the reaping and taking things in and out of the field. Torah matahei aleha. What's going to happen to your Torah learning? What's going to happen to the Torah learning? If you're ehrlich, if you're real, if you're genuine, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take care of you. Now, if someone were to actually give you this advice, you would be skeptical, right? Rebbe, I'm having a hard time making enough per month. Our budget's about $8,000. I'm bringing in 6.5. We're about 40 grand right now in credit card debt. What do you suggest? Torah, mata aleha. Just keep on using the credit card. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take care of you. So for the Hamonam, for the vast majority of us, it's probably not responsible advice. And the Gemara actually says, Harbe asu kerebi Yishmael, v'alsa b'yadon. Many people followed the advice of Rebbe Yishmael, meaning they learned many hours a day, and they worked, and they were able to do both. Now, what does many hours a day actually mean? Right? How many hours your average balabas, an accountant, a lawyer, person in real estate, a doctor, how many hours were they learning per day? So the Shach in Yeridea says, he's discussing what you should be learning, right? Torah shebichsav, Torah shebal peh, how do you divide the time? And he says it's very important that you learn Shas, you go through Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos. But he says for those balabatim who only learn 3 or 4 hours a day, they should make sure to incorporate halacha lemaisa as well. So even those who were following Rebbe Yishmael, it was more than 10 minutes a day. They were really applying themselves to be able to learn and work, and they were successful. Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai, but those who followed the higher madrega of the Rashbi, lo also biyadan, the vast majority of people did not succeed, and they were not able to continue living that life lamala min hateva. Now it's interesting, the Rashbi himself understood this. There's a line that's quoted often. Reb Shimon bar Yochai said, or he's quoted to have said, Re'isi b'nei Aliyah, I have seen b'nei Aliyah, I've seen people who really excel. I've seen people that they don't only speak about growth, but they actually, they change themselves. And they're able to work on midos. And they're able to learn more than they did before and wake up earlier. And as they grow older, year by year, they come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I've seen those people, v'hein muatin. But they're the minority of the population. Re'isi b'nei Aliyah v'hein muatin. But there are not that many of them out there. Halavai, our tefillah is we should be amongst those muatin. To conclude, I think one of the most unique aspects of the Rashbi is when we put everything together, right? We have this chain of Mesorah. We have Rabbi Akiva and the failed experiment, so to speak, with the yeshiva of thousands of Talmidim. What they were lacking was the Maila that Reb Shimon bar Yochai had, and likely he made that a focus because of the teachings that he gained from his Rebbe and the experience that his Rebbe had to go through. And that, says the Zohar, that was why the Zohar was accepted. That's why the Torah's Hanister, the entire teaching of Kabbalah, was able to go through the Rashbi, because he had that chavivis, that ava, that mutual respect. To be on a madrega where you could literally say, I don't work and all I do is learn, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes care of the parnasa, and you're the real deal, like the Rashbi was. Every time in Mishnayos and Shas where it says, if you're learning all day, what's an example of someone who learns all day? Like Reb Shimon bar Yochai and his chaverim, so then you have a different standard of halacha. You might not have to stop in daven if you're learning on that level of diligence. So to be on that level, but at the same time to have a complete hakara and desire to relate to others and to love other people, even though I'm so above and beyond you, that duality is something that's very, very special. I saw in the Tekanos of the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, one of the great Kabbalists of all time, the author of the Tomer Devorah and other Kabbalistic works, The Ramak, says Reb Chaim Volozhin, brought Kabbalah to one particular level, and then the Arizal brought it to the next Madrega. But the Ramak is known as kind of setting forth the foundation of Kabbalah, living in Svas in that magical time, together with the Arizal and the Beis Yosef and the Sefer Charedim and with Shlomo Kabetz. So we have actually the Takanos, or the Kabbalos, the dreams and the acceptance that he made. He wrote down, these are the things I want to accept upon myself, and there are actually many more than these three, but I want to highlight number 1 and number 3. So when we think of making Kabbalos, what's an example of a Kabbalah? From the hours of 3 to 4, I am not going to say any Lashon Hara at all, 3 to 4 a.m. We'll work on daytime hours later. No Lashon Hara. Or from now on, at least once every 3 weeks, I'm going to bench from a bencher. That's a Kabbalah. Says the Ramak, Al yifne libo milaharher b'divrei Torah v'divrei Kedusha. I am being makabel upon myself not to allow my heart to stray, my mind to wander from thinking about words of Torah and devarim shebekadusha. Shelo yehei libo panui v'reik mehure mitzvah, b'torah mitzvahs, that my mind should never be empty or void from thinking of kedusha and devekis and mitzvos. Kadei sheyeh libo mishkan l'shechina, in order that my heart should be a sanctuary for the divine presence. How many of you have made a Kabbalah that your heart should become a sanctuary for the divine presence? And if you did, we should speak after, because that's not a very healthy Kabbalah to make on our Madrega. But then take a look at number 3. La'olam yehei daito mu'urav im habrios. I will always be able to relate to other people. V'yisnoheg imohim benachas, and speak to them and treat them in a pleasant way. V'afilu al ha'ovrim ala Torah yisnoheg benachas, and even those people who are doing averos, who are disrespecting me or the Torah, I'm going to treat you like a mensch. I'm going to respect you. I'm going to love you. La'olam yehidaita ma'urav mabrios. How do you have these two things working together? On one hand, I want my heart to be a mishkan for the Shekhinah, and I'm never going to stop thinking about Torah, mitzvos, and kedusha. On the other hand, at the same time, I'm going to shmooze with you and ask you questions that interest you, even though I don't like fishing or I never heard of football. But mu'urav mabrios, to have both of those working simultaneously, that takes a mastery. That takes a shlita, having real control over oneself spiritually and emotionally. And I think just like we see this in the Ramak, this is what we see in the Rashbi as well. So we come to Lag BaOmer, just in a few days from now. We celebrate the continuity of the Torah. We celebrate the day that Rabbi Kiva gave smicha to the Rashbi and the other 4 Talmidim. And ultimately it's a celebration of Mesorah, that through everything we've been through, we have the fire of Torah, we celebrate, we sing, Bar Yochai, and we appreciate the legacy of Shimon, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. We should be zocheh to emulate his ways. Have a wonderful Shabbos.